Many of the businesses that I've seen struggling to solve their compliance or ethics and trust challenges are actually facing technical implementation problems, right, where the rubber meets the road. There's a view of an open source project that allows you to look at it as a ROPA or an Article 30 inventory assessment. And there's a view that looks like a data catalog for an engineer. The difficulty for most organizations is they lack the context and intelligence about that information to be able to do that.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, this is our third interview in the Privacy Tech series, and we're now moving from San Francisco, where both Ketch and Data Grail from our previous two interviews are based, to New York City, where Ethyca is based. We're joined by Cillian Kieran, who is Ethyca's founder and CEO, and today our angle is a little more technical, as Ethyca's tools are more geared towards engineers and development teams rather than DPOs, chief privacy officers or marketing professionals. Cillian is a serial entrepreneur and seasoned privacy engineer with 2 decades of experience leading data-intensive businesses. He combines deep technical expertise with a track record of building and scaling companies, including a global digital agency serving Fortune 500 clients. With him, we'll explore the very notion of a privacy-by-design infrastructure for developers, including open-source data classification, smarter auditing, reusable components, and AI-scale data repurposing. And you'll see what I mean. Let's go for it. Cillian, thanks for joining me.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sergio.
It's a pleasure. So, privacy compliance as an engineering problem. What is that? What is your angle in terms of the effort we could make on the technical side to get closer to compliance?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think it's important to say it is not a case of saying that privacy compliance is only solved by engineers. Rather, it's recognizing that as the complexity of data-driven systems and enterprise technologies increased and increased, the need to better understand and collaborate with engineers is necessary. So that is to say, if we were to cast our minds back to 2015, 2016 in anticipation of the GDPR, we were very focused on understanding or interpreting the documentation and what that meant in terms of business impact. The natural next step of that is to take that business impact and understand how it actually affects our technology systems and our operations. Many of the businesses that I've seen struggling to solve their compliance or ethics and trust challenges are actually facing technical implementation problems, right, where the rubber meets the road. And so our goal and our philosophy is to provide the tools that give you a trusted layer of data. So that is to say, technology that ensures that engineers can work closely with lawyers to solve compliance problems in collaboration, right? Like that's the goal.
That's very good. So I would say the ultimate dream, you know what reminds me of? This thing reminds me of Larry Lessig in the late 90s, talking about code as law,
Mm-hmm,
right?
absolutely.
When we had this copyright, copyleft debate thing, or maybe copyright, you had DRM, could be self-enforced. When it gets to that, how do you find the coexistence between the engineering world and the legal world?
Yeah. So what you're describing is so interesting because fundamentally, it's uh, it's a cultural difference that creates some of the friction necessary to get the outcome that enterprise needs. It isn't to say that these two teams don't want to work together, but legal teams um, deal in subtlety and nuance and interpretation and risk evaluation. And the very nature of engineering as a practice is absolute, it's determined, it's binary, right? And that can create this perception of like a cultural butting of heads between legal teams and engineers. And what is fundamentally missing, therefore, is a defined translation layer. So a common understanding of what a lawyer can reasonably infer to be fact or a comfortable range of facts that they will stand by, and definitions that an engineer can interpret. So one of a common example of the challenge that we see, and it's a silly example, but there's still debates in most organizations of what constitutes personal data or not personal data. Now, if the legal team are still philosophically debating this, but asking engineers to ensure that they label all of the data in inverted commas, we must label all the data, we've got to know what we have so that we can report on it. It's very difficult because you're asking a non-privacy subject matter expert, but a deeply technical expert to make determinations that they're not equipped to. So what's missing there is a translation layer, right? And so a lot of the goal of our work at Ethyca in being responsible for FIDES was to deliver an open source standard, right? A set of tools that intentionally free, interoperable, and common to most regulations on the basis that aside from selling privacy technology, if we as an industry, both legal, governance, risk compliance, privacy adjacent, and technical subject matter experts don't define a standard or a close to standard, there will always be dissonance that will result in a failure to comply. And so the goal of the initiative when we started 6 years ago in the open source, 5.5, 6 years ago, was to provide a translation layer. And so what I mean by that is, and you talk about the examples of Lessig's law, code as law or law as code. There have been several attempts at that over the last, I would say, 2 decades of defining programmatic legal constructs or frameworks. There are several that came from Milan. There's another that started in France. My view of them, not that they were very thoughtful, extremely academic research, is that they focused rather on the detailed subtlety of the law rather than the technical complexity of enforcement for engineers. And so we started slightly in reverse, right? And not to say better, but a different approach to see if we could get adoption. We decided to start with the pains that engineers have when they try to interpret the laws given to them by lawyers. And we provided in FIDES what we call a policy as code or privacy as code, a set of opinions, I would say reasonably strong opinions, on how you define or determine personal data and the use of data. And the goal of that was to provide guardrails to an engineer so that they, not to say they could think less, but they had to worry less about making decisions they were not equipped to do. So that you could get to a greater level ground truth faster. So we could say, we definitely have these kinds of data. We definitely process them in this way. And we can now make determinations of risk based on that. And so the intent of FIDES is that on the one hand, it meets an engineer where they are because they can use it. It's written, it should be pointed out, it's written in code, it's written in YAML. So it's written in configuration files, which is a very comfortable language for data engineers. It can be translated into what looks like a ROPA for a legal team. So you have this meeting of minds. There's a view of an open source project that allows you to look at it as a ROPA or an Article 30 inventory assessment. And there's a view that looks like a data catalog for an engineer. This sort of Venn diagram means that two parties can meet in the middle. They can confer and collaborate on an outcome that leads to the success of both teams, but do it in the workflows and sort of cultural environments that they're most used to. And that was the goal with FIDES.
Does it make it easy to then audit? So if we all speak the same language, because something that we see is that you may have all the depth that you want in terms of privacy engineering. I've seen people putting a lot of time into technical safeguards to then not being able to benefit from it, because when you hit the market, nobody's really able to tell the difference. I've seen people going really far. I mean, in some A/B testing platforms, analytics platforms, going the extra mile, doing things that really take time. Hiring expensive teams, and then they hit the market, and everyone has the same seal of approval. Everyone claims to be CCPA, GDPR,
of course,
and then everyone once you hit a procurement team and you're a software development company, for example, a SaaS company, then procurement is going to look mostly for security, very well standardized, accreditations like SOC 2, ISO 27001. So do you see progress in that regard, in the sense that thanks to this kind of framework being open, you could help people go into greater detail in terms of proving that they are going the extra mile?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's probably three facets to answering that. One is obviously the open source itself is not, let's say, rubber stamped with SOC 2 or ISO 27001. Although I would note that it's a footnote of the history of the FIDES open source is it was modeled very closely against the ISO 27701 PIM standards. So it actually maps to the Privacy Information Management System standards, and that was by design at the start. So the open source is closely aligned with the common frameworks for compliance. In addition to which, then obviously the layer on top of that is we as a business, what we provide on top of the open source is tooling that allows you to leverage that specificity for compliance outcomes, whether that is SOC or SOC adjacent, ISO or ISO adjacent, or specific preparation for specific regulatory frameworks based on the industry that you're in. I think what I would say is, as it relates to the auditability of it, even in the open source, even if you're not buying technology from Ethyca, and one of the reasons I urge people to use our open source is we really have invested tremendously over 5 years. If you never ever speak to us and you just use the open source, you get a defined labeling convention that meets all of the major regulations, all of them. And I say that very bluntly, all of the US state privacy regulations, the major regulations in Latin America, the major European and UK regs, and the same in Asia, Middle East, etc. It's mapped to all of those. That's free. On top of which it has a server with an audit trail in it. So if you're labeling data using FIDES, you have an auditable trail of that work that you've done over time. And that's all free. That is just in an effort to benefit the industry. So from my perspective, I can't emphasize enough to people the shared benefit of using this. It's one of the reasons that it's been adopted by so many industry groups outside of Ethyca, like the IAB, for example.
So, for example, things that are common across the board, sensitive data, or the very threshold between personal data, right, and anonymous data, as you've been able to label that. And I wonder whether, there's some complexity in that, right? Because sensitive data, for example, in the US will include financial data. In the EU, it would include trade union membership, right? There's a few differences, but you've managed to ingrain that into this.
So the way to think about it, again, in an effort to simplify, so what you've hit upon, Sergio, is one of the major pains for most organizations. They perhaps focus initially on a particular regulation or jurisdiction just based on their center of operations. So maybe they're oriented towards Europe or towards California. They address maybe thinking about labeling and operational privacy around that regulation. And then they find that that interpretation does not apply in another market. So the solution to that has been to generalize the labeling convention away from a regulatory framework. So what I mean is we coach privacy and engineering teams to label data consistently. So to take that example, trade union affiliation, you label the data as trade union affiliation. You then can overlay in the ontology the regulation that you care about in that particular moment or the jurisdiction in which you're operating. So you can say, we have trade union data. We have collected it in the UK. Therefore, it is sensitive personal information as determined by the ICO in the UK. However, if you collected this data in California, you might take a different assessment of it. Or distinct from that might be the My Health, My Data Act in Oregon, for example. All of those mappings have been completed in FIDES. So when you apply one label, what you're essentially doing then is taking that context and making a determination based on jurisdiction on how it should be processed. And that's the benefit, right? Because instead of then asking product and engineering teams, hey, what are we collecting and where did we collect it? And therefore, is it personal or non-personal? These are very complex matrices of questions that ultimately result in most often some kind of DPIA workflow. And the challenge with that is there aren't enough forms in the world to make those assessments. You could be filling in forms for the rest of your life. Instead, by answering the question, what kind of data are we handling? And then where did we collect it? We can ladder that up to an informed decision on which we can infer risk without filling in an 18-page form, right?
What about building or sort of helping people compensate for the shortage of talent in privacy engineering? Mm-hmm. I see that as a common complaint. People want to have more, if not privacy enhancing technologies as per the sort of usual catalog, at least some techniques to de-identify, aggregate, basic stuff, k-anonymity, L-diversity, all of these basic measures. And people have no resources, and it's very hard to find people that want to do it, because if you are an engineer, it's not so common to find people that want to go into privacy engineering.
Absolutely.
So do you see that thanks to your tools and your efforts that we could also get to that, to having some pre-built modules or some sort of, not just labeling, so facilitating ROPA and mapping, but instead being able to let people modularize the use of some of these components where you can, again, make up for the shortage of privacy engineers?
Yeah, it's a great question. In order to answer that, and it's a slight digression, I might philosophically explain the layers of how we think about the problem as it relates to privacy and governance, and the way we think about what our tools do. Because you're absolutely right? It isn't just labeling. So if we step back for a moment, the first thing you raise is the point of privacy engineering. And I think the macroeconomic context we're in is really important. And that might sound strange, but what I mean is businesses are being asked to do more with less. And there's an obsession with the idea that AI will consume the world and we will need fewer engineers. So the idea of frankly hiring privacy engineers, which we are a privacy engineering business, therefore I have nothing but respect for privacy engineers. I have to acknowledge that that is seen as a cost center. For most businesses, investing in privacy compliance adjacent engineering is a cost center. The way we think about the problem is different. The goal of every organization today, particularly with the advent of Gen AI, is to squeeze the value and life out of the data that we have, right? Like, how do we extract as much value from this incredibly valuable asset? The difficulty for most organizations is they lack the context and intelligence about that information to be able to do that. The right, I believe, culturally, the right role for privacy and data governance teams to play in an organization is to enable the acceleration of the use of data safely and ethically, right? When framed this way, the benefit becomes real to the business rather than being a cost center. It becomes an enabler to growth, to innovation. If that is the view that a business takes, then you start to answer the important questions, which are, well, we have either collected a lot of data or we will continue to collect and process data. And what we want to do with that isn't simply serve the rights of users in California or Brazil or Europe, but we want to be able to use that data for benefit for our business, maybe new product innovation, maybe training foundation models, maybe inference. But in order to do that, we need to be confident in where the data came from, what it is, who it belongs to, and what are the risks associated with its use. Now, if you work in privacy, those questions seem obvious. They're the perennial things we ask, right? But in order to answer all of those at sort of what I would call AI scale data consumption, right, like vast petabyte scale consumption of data, you need some kind of foundation data map. If you're in privacy, you'd call it a data map. If you're an engineer, you would call it a data catalog or a data inventory. But what you want is a source of truth that says, this is the data we have, this is where it came from, this is what it is. You then need a layer that explains how you can use it, the purpose and use of that data. We might call it consent if we want, but we need a tool that says to us, or a solution that can confirm to us, we have this data and we may use it for these purposes by individual, not in aggregate. You then need tooling to orchestrate, so retrieve data, delete data, de-identify the data to make it safe and sanitized to use. And then you need a policy enforcement layer, right? You need to be able to describe business commitments and enforce those. Now, if you take those four layers, right? So context that describes what we have and where we got it from, permission or preference and consent that defines what we can use it for, orchestration that can allow us to delete, de-identify, anonymize, and then policy enforcement that can allow us to describe our business commitments. What you have there, if you combine all of those, is a layer of trusted data. We can confidently assert as a business, we know our data, we know where it came from, we know what we can use it for, and we have the safeguards in place to allow us to squeeze value from it. So the way we think about our product is in that order. There is a context tool, data mapping, data inventory, etc. We call that Helios. There is a consent, preference, and orchestration platform. We call that Janus. There is a deletion, de-identification, DSR response and retention tool called Lethe. And Australis is the AI governance layer. When you combine those, to your original question about the role that privacy plays, this is no longer a privacy engineering platform. It's a suite of tools that allow every stakeholder in an organization to leverage value from the data. If you're a business user, you might simply want to understand, can I use this data for the thing I'm about to do? If you're a data engineer, it might be to enforce something in a pipeline before you train a foundation model. If you're in a data science team, it may be specifically collecting particular insights that will allow you to perform inference in a already trained model. What you need is a suite of tools that touch the entire organization, the ability to define policy and business commitment, and the ability to enforce that on the layer of context that you have.
We had another episode on this P3P, the platform for privacy preference from the early 2000s.
Yes, of course.
And and I used to participate in a very nerdy group at the W3C called Legal XML e-contracts. And the whole idea was that we could have terms speak to each other. So I would, as a consumer, I mean, this has always been the dream, right? You can set some preferences in a system that you really understand in your language, and then you just let it fly. I mean, now with agents, maybe we get there, right? Where you can delegate your preferences in a way that you understand in your language, and then it will go and negotiate whatever it is willing to accept on your behalf. Again, another dream, another engineering dream.
Right.
But still, I'm still thinking that there's going to be the element of repurposing, right? So you mentioned AI scale, and if you could have the safeguards in place, it's the little opportunity we have to then take data that could be granular first, and then eventually in aggregate could have a lot of value. Do you see that opportunity, or is it too far-fetched?
I don't think it's far-fetched at all. I think I think we're there. I think it's happening. I think we don't talk about it enough, perhaps, as a business. And unfortunately, I don't think I can name the specific client that I'm thinking of immediately, but we have a client in the life sciences, medical technology field. They're collecting very large volumes of what is heavily regulated data by any definition. And it is also highly unstructured because it's largely collected through the sort of evidence gathering of questionnaires and assessments on behalf of patients. And they are using our tools to remove, based on policy conditions, anything that has been determined to be a personal identifier in the jurisdiction in which that data has been collected, and then add noise to sufficiently de-identify that to get to a degree of anonymity that would satisfy not just a regulator, but a high bar of ethics, so they can use that data for correlation or for training. We do this today, and we do this at very, very large scale. I won't say petabytes, but near petabytes of data of unstructured information. So that moment has arrived. I think to get there, an organization has to be willing to do some hard work. And it's a trite analogy, particularly in the current climate. I think the difficulty is that more often than not, privacy and compliance is treated as the analogy is we want a painkiller. I want to know my data now and generate a ROPA, rather than accepting that this is a vaccination process. There is a painful hill to overcome that will unlock a very long-term accelerative benefit for the business. There's no question. But you have to face it. You have to pay down an investment in the short to medium term to do that. But you do that and you can unlock value from your data that is exponentially greater than what you have today. So we are there. I think the tools can already support those use cases. We do them at scale. I think the businesses that can achieve that benefit are the ones that have made the investment over the course of 18 months, 2 years, and accept that that is the direction of travel for their business's success in the next decade.
Anything that you find really exciting as what's coming around the corner, something that really gets you excited because you think it could make everything better? Two things that are
revealing perhaps too much about what's going on in our business, but there's two things that are very exciting to me that we've been working on for the last probably 18 months, 2 years, and we've not released publicly yet, and we're getting close to the point where we release them for the first time. And I should preface with the fact that I think those that know me well will know that I'm a slight AI cynic. My background's physics, therefore I think it's statistical maths, and AI is just marketing. That isn't to say that AI does not have value. I do not mean that. I think there's tremendous value in large language models. The role that we see those playing is twofold. One is improving the deterministic effort of high volume data labeling. And that might sound very boring, but I can't tell you how many organizations still don't know their data. And so what we've specifically been working on is the ability to deploy very lightweight, very private models that exist on client premise. So there's no data egress, there's no data processing risks, there's no privacy risks. And those models are being used to infer not just the category of data, but the purpose of use, the likely ingress and egress, so lineage. And they are doing this to degrees of accuracy that were not possible 18 months ago. So we're in the like high 90th percentiles at this point, which is fantastic. This is going to exponentially decrease the level of effort and the complexity for labeling data in non-technical businesses, right? That is to say, an organization that has vast amounts of data can now confidently assert it knows its information, and will be able to do that very, very quickly. So overcoming some of that vaccination pain that we referred to, right? Like being able to really know your information. The other areas that Ethyca is very focused on is how we ensure that a business can leverage the data that's collected over time from disparate sources. So we talk a lot about data lakes, data warehouses, and data intelligence that we want at scale. But unlocking the value from that data requires being able to enforce policies at vast scale across distributed systems in financial services, et cetera. And we've been working on middleware tools that leverage AI to identify the use of data in real time in analytics systems and enforce policies in the analytics pipeline. So the ability to make sure that we use Sergio's data in some analytics and inference tasks, but not in others based on his specific preferences in the jurisdiction he's collected. And that happens in real time as the data is being analyzed. That was impossible 3 years ago. That ability to parse and infer that context and make those decisions in analytics queries is going to unlock a whole generation of data intelligence tools that don't exist today.
That's really good. Cillian, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Sergio.
Okay, that's all for today. Follow us on Blue Sky and in the Masters of Privacy Altogether profile, you will find the starter pack, which includes the feeds of all of our past guests. There is also a Masters of Privacy LinkedIn channel, which I invite you to follow, where you will find links to our transcripts, cheat sheets, and other surprises every now and then. Our main website is mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.